like to imagine the fall of Berlin as a final stand, a ruined capital, red banners rising through the smoke, one last charge in the rubble before the war finally ends. But that isn't how it happened. There was no final line, no cohesive defense, no moment where Germany stood, saluted, and fell. What happened in Berlin was something far worse. The war didn't end. It disintegrated. By April 1945, Berlin was not a city fighting a battle. It was a collection of fragments, fragments of armies, fragments of commands, fragments of beliefs clinging to survival long after meaning had vanished. Hitler Youth stood at intersections with Panzerfausts they barely knew how to fire. SS units, once feared across Europe, had been reduced to platoons, then squads, then lone men firing from stairwells and disappearing into smoke. Soviet Guards riflemen advanced house by house, floor by floor, losing men for rooms that would be abandoned an hour later. Elevators became firing points, sewer tunnels became front lines, hospitals became fortresses, then mass graves. Civilians hid in basements while entire streets changed hands without anyone knowing who was winning or why. This wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a collapse, caught on fire. And to understand Berlin in 1945, you have to forget everything you think you know about how wars end. Because when the Red Army entered the city, Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting because it no longer knew how to stop. By the spring of 1945, Berlin had already been bombed for nearly 3 years. What remained wasn't rubble in the romantic sense. It was structural ruin. Entire neighborhoods were hollow shells. Buildings stood without interiors, staircases hanging into open air, rooms exposed like broken teeth. Streets were clogged with wreckage, abandoned trams, overturned carts, shattered glass, bodies half covered by dust and brick. Electricity worked only when it felt like it. Water pressure failed daily. Food existed mostly as rumor. And yet more than 2 million civilians were still trapped inside the city. Old men, women, children. They weren't waiting to be liberated. They were waiting for the moment the fighting reached their building. On paper, Berlin was defended by nearly 1 million German troops. In reality, that number meant almost nothing. What actually stood between the Red Army and the Reichstag was a patchwork. Shattered Wehrmacht units pulled back from the Oder. SS formations bled white and thrown into the city in pieces. Police battalions, foreign volunteers, Volkssturm units armed with rifles older than the men carrying them. Hitler Youth, as young as 12, handed anti-tank weapons and told they were now soldiers. Most of these units had never trained together. Many had no radios. Some had no officers left alive. Entire battalions existed only because someone had written their name on a map. A German staff officer later described the defense of Berlin with brutal honesty. There was no front, he said. There were only places where shooting happened. By this point, Adolf Hitler was no longer commanding a war. He was issuing orders to formations that no longer existed from a bunker that controlled nothing beyond its own corridors. Divisions were ordered to counterattack through areas already occupied by Soviet armor. Phantom armies were expected to relieve the city. Maps were updated less often than rumors. Command authority fractured downward, then sideways, then vanished altogether. What replaced it was local survival. Company commanders decided which streets to hold. Squad leaders decided which rooms to defend. Sometimes individual soldiers decided which staircase to die in. The war became personal, claustrophobic, close enough to smell. On the other side, the Red Army approaching Berlin was not a blunt wave. It was hardened, disciplined, and exhausted. These were Guards armies that had fought from Stalingrad to the Oder. Men who had crossed rivers under fire, assaulted cities block by block, buried entire units in the ruins of Poland. They did not expect Berlin to be easy. They expected it to be lethal. Soviet commanders understood something the German High Command no longer did. Urban combat destroys armies. So they adapted. Instead of mass attacks, Soviet units advanced in small assault groups, infantry squads reinforced with combat engineers, flamethrower teams, machine gunners. Tanks used not as breakthrough weapons, but as mobile artillery. Each group was assigned one building at a time. Not a block, not a street, a single building, sometimes a single floor. This wasn't maneuver warfare. It was systematic destruction, and Berlin was about to become the largest urban killing ground in European history. The city itself worked against everyone inside it. Wide boulevards became artillery corridors. Basements connected to sewer networks. Subway tunnels turned into movement routes, ambush points, and mass graves. German defenders fired from attics, then vanished downstairs. Soviet troops blasted entry points with satchel charges and grenades, then fought their way upward room by room, stair by stair. Every building became its own battle. Every battle had its own dead. No one, German or Soviet, could see more than a few meters ahead. For civilians, there was no front line, only distance. If your building stood near a crossroads, it became a strong point. If it had a basement, it became a shelter. If it had a rooftop, it became a firing position. Some families moved 5 or 6 times in a single day, fleeing gunfire only to run straight into it again. Others never moved at all. They stayed where they were and waited. On April 16, 1945, Soviet artillery opened fire. It wasn't a bombardment. It was a sentence. Thousands of guns fired at once. The night sky turned white. Shock waves shattered windows kilometers away. The ground shook as if it were being torn apart from below. A German civilian later wrote that it felt like the earth itself had been condemned. When the shelling lifted, the Red Army moved forward, not into a capital, but into a city that was already dying, tearing itself apart from the inside. Berlin was not defended as a city. It was defended as thousands of isolated deaths. And from this point on, Berlin would stop being a battle. It would become a collapse. The first Soviet troops did not enter Berlin through some dramatic gate. They came through smoke, shell holes, and suburbs that no longer looked like a city at all. Places that had names on maps but no longer resembled streets, only burned ground dotted with broken walls. The outer districts were already collapsing when the Red Army arrived. Not falling back, not retreating, collapsing. German units here were shadows of formations. A company might have 30 men. A battalion might have 1 working machine gun. Ammunition was counted in handfuls. Orders arrived late if they arrived at all. And yet, this was where some of the most desperate fighting began. Because this was where the regime threw its youngest and its oldest. Boys who had grown up under air raids. Men who had survived one war already and were now dragged into another. They were told the capital must be held, that Berlin was the heart of Germany, that if Berlin stood, everything else could be reversed. None of it was true, but belief was all that remained. At intersections and crossroads, Hitler youth units were positioned with Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank weapons with brutal power and no forgiveness. Fire too early, and you missed. Fire too late, and you died. Some of these boys had trained for weeks, some for days. Some had never fired a weapon before. They waited anyway. When the first Soviet tanks appeared, moving cautiously, infantry fanned out around them, rifles probing windows and doorways. The boys watched the machines roll closer, hearing the engines before they saw the holes. 30 tons of steel moving slowly, deliberately, like something alive. Orders were simple. Let the tank come close. Very close. At 10 meters, the Panzerfaust could kill anything on tracks. At 10 meters, there was nowhere to run. Some fired and ran. Some fired and froze. Some never fired at all. Soviet tank crews learned quickly. Streets were death traps. Crossroads were kill zones. Tanks stopped advancing without infantry. Infantry refused to move without tanks. Progress slowed to a crawl measured in meters and minutes. Buildings were cleared not because they were important, but because they blocked the next building. The Red Army did not surge forward. It chewed. German defenders adapted in their own way. They stopped thinking in terms of lines and started thinking in terms of rooms. A stairwell could be held longer than a hallway. A collapsed floor made a perfect choke point. A single machine gun placed correctly could halt an entire platoon until artillery was brought in to bury the building entirely. Sometimes the Soviets didn't bother clearing a building. They simply sealed it. Flamethrowers were used sparingly, but decisively. Smoke grenades filled rooms. Explosives collapsed entrances. Men inside were left to suffocate, burn, or emerge unarmed. There were no prisoners taken by accident, only by decision. Below the streets, another war unfolded. Berlin's sewer system became a second city, dark, wet, and echoing with movement. German troops used it to appear behind Soviet lines. Soviet assault groups used it to bypass strong points. Wounded men crawled through it trying to escape. Civilians hid in it when basements became death traps. Fights erupted underground, where no one could see more than arm's length. Grenades bounced off brick walls and detonated in water. Gunfire deafened everyone involved. Men drowned without being wounded. Sometimes both sides abandoned the tunnels entirely, sealing entrances and leaving anyone inside to their fate. Above ground, the city burned in layers. Smoke clung to everything. Visibility dropped to meters. Orientation vanished. Soldiers used rubble piles as landmarks. When those disappeared, they were lost. Entire German units were wiped out without Soviet commanders ever knowing who they were. Entire Soviet platoons disappeared in collapsed buildings, their loss recorded hours later, sometimes days. Civilians moved when they could. When they couldn't, they hid. Basements filled with families sitting in silence while the world above them collapsed. Some buildings took direct hits and vanished instantly. Others burned slowly, filling shelters with smoke until people were forced to choose between fire and gunfire. Hospitals were overwhelmed within days. Doctors worked without anesthesia. Wounded lay in corridors, stairwells, courtyards. When Soviet troops arrived, some hospitals surrendered immediately. Others were defended until artillery reduced them to rubble. The idea of neutrality vanished. Anything that stood became part of the battle. As the Red Army pushed deeper, the Germans fell back not toward a line, but toward symbols, bridges, ministries, railway stations, places that meant something even when they no longer mattered militarily. The Tiergarten became a killing ground. Once a park, it turned into open terrain under direct fire. Crossing it meant exposure from every direction. Men ran, crawled, froze, and died in grass churned into mud. At night, the fighting didn't stop. It only changed shape. Flares turned streets into ghostly corridors. Tracer fire arced through smoke. Shadows moved where no one could be sure who they belonged to. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. Men slept sitting up, leaning against walls, weapons across their laps. Some never woke. Inside the city, command had dissolved completely. Orders contradicted each other. Units overlapped and collided. Some German soldiers fought on because they believed surrender meant death. Others fought because there was nowhere left to go. SS remnants were mixed with regular army troops, Hitler Youth, police. Old rivalries meant nothing now. Rank meant little. Whoever had ammunition gave orders. Soviet command was tighter, but even there chaos crept in. Radios failed. Runners were killed. Assault groups fought on instinct as much as plan. Officers led from the front because there was nowhere else to lead from. Casualties mounted at a pace that shocked even veterans. A building could cost a platoon. A block could cost a company. A crossroads could eat a battalion in a single afternoon. And still, the Red Army pushed forward, because behind them was 3 years of war, and ahead of them was the heart of the Reich. By the time the fighting reached the inner districts, Berlin no longer functioned as a city. It was a battlefield stacked vertically. Basements, ground floors, upper stories, rooftops. Every level a different fight. Every fight disconnected from the next. Men died without knowing if they were winning. Often, they weren't. And somewhere beneath the city, deep underground, the leadership of Germany listened to the explosions draw closer, still issuing orders, still believing in formations that had already ceased to exist. The collapse was accelerating, and it was about to reach its final, most violent phase. If you want, I can continue straight into the final days around the Reichstag, the bunker, and the moment when the fighting didn't end, but simply stopped. By the last week of April, the distance between the front lines and the Reich Chancellery could be measured not in kilometers, but in minutes of survival. The inner city was no longer defended in any organized sense. What remained was resistance by habit, by fear, and by isolation. German units fought on without knowing where their neighbors were, or if they even existed. Some believed relief was coming. Others knew it wasn't, but kept fighting anyway. The Red Army closed in from every direction, compressing the city like a vice. Bridges were seized or destroyed. Rail yards burned. Government buildings that had once symbolized power were reduced to landmarks for artillery observers. The Reichstag loomed ahead, but it was not yet the objective people later imagined. To the Soviet infantrymen, it was just another massive stone structure filled with defenders, firing points, and death. Before it could be taken, everything around it had to be erased. The fighting intensified as space disappeared. There was no room to maneuver, no room to retreat. Streets narrowed. Rubble rose higher. Fire spread unchecked, fed by gas lines, wooden beams, and paper archives that went up like kindling. German defenders learned that holding a position too long meant annihilation. Soviet troops learned that advancing too fast meant ambush. The pace became brutal and methodical. Grenade, burst of fire, silence, move. German ammunition stocks ran dry. Panzerfausts became prized objects passed from hand to hand. Rifles were taken from the dead. Wounded men stayed in the line because there was nowhere to send them. SS officers still tried to enforce discipline. Some succeeded. Many were ignored. Executions for desertion occurred even now, even here, but they changed nothing. Fear no longer motivated men who believed they were already dead. The Hitler Youth still fought in pockets. Some showed terrifying resolve. Others broke and ran the moment tanks appeared. A few surrendered. Many didn't know how. Soviet troops encountered resistance that seemed irrational. Positions defended long after they had lost all tactical value. Men firing from ruins that would be flattened minutes later by artillery. This was not strategy. It was inertia. The Tiergarten became a slaughter ground. Artillery chewed the open space to mud. Trees were splintered into spikes. Bodies lay where they fell, impossible to retrieve. Tanks advanced in short dashes, halting to fire point-blank into stone facades, where defenders hid among shattered columns and statues. Nearby, the Spree River became both barrier and grave. Bridges collapsed under fire. Men drowned under the weight of equipment. Others tried to swim across and vanished in the current. The closer the fighting moved toward the government district, the more symbolic the resistance became. Orders were given to hold specific buildings because of their names, not their military value. Ministries, archives, the Chancellery itself. Inside Hitler's bunker, the war existed only as reports and explosions. The sound of artillery never stopped. The air smelled of damp concrete and fear. Maps were marked with units that no longer existed. Counterattacks were ordered that could not happen. Those still inside the bunker lived in a shrinking world measured by corridors and rooms. Above them, the city was being torn apart. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler killed himself. The news did not end the fighting. In many places, it changed nothing at all. Some German units fought on unaware. Others refused to believe it. A few surrendered immediately. SS formations, especially those composed of foreign volunteers or diehards, continued to resist with fanatical intensity. The idea of Germany no longer mattered. Only the next minute did. The final assault on the Reichstag began not as a dramatic charge, but as another grinding advance. Soviet assault groups crossed open ground under murderous fire. Machine guns swept the approaches. Snipers fired from shattered windows. Men fell by the dozens. Others stepped over them. When Soviet troops reached the building, the fight moved inside. The Reichstag was a fortress of stone and smoke. Stairwells became killing zones, hallways filled with dust and screams. Combat was so close that rifles were used as clubs. Defenders fought from behind overturned furniture, piles of debris, anything that could stop a bullet. Some German soldiers fired until their weapons jammed, then waited. Red Army soldiers fought upward, floor by floor, room by room. Flamethrowers were brought forward. Explosives shattered doors. Flags were carried not as symbols, but as signals to show which sections were taken. The famous photographs came later. The reality was chaos. Men got lost inside the building. Units mixed. Command vanished entirely. Fighting continued in isolated pockets long after Soviet flags were raised on the roof. Even after the Reichstag was secured, the war did not end cleanly. Shooting continued throughout the city. Snipers fired at silhouettes. Isolated German groups refused to surrender. Soviet units advanced anyway, clearing buildings that no longer mattered. Finally, on May 2nd, the remaining German commanders in Berlin surrendered. The guns fell silent, not all at once, but unevenly. A street here, a building there. Silence crept across the ruins in patches. When it was over, Berlin was unrecognizable. The city was not conquered, it was dismantled. Hundreds of thousands were dead, soldiers, civilians, children. The exact number would never be known. Too many bodies were buried under rubble, burned beyond recognition, or lost entirely. The war in Europe ended not with a final charge, but with exhaustion. Men sat down where they stood. Some cried, some slept, some stared into nothing. There was no victory parade in those streets, only smoke, silence, and the weight of what had just happened. Berlin did not fall. It collapsed, and when the collapse ended, there was nothing left to fight over. If you want, I can continue with a closing epilogue reflecting on what Berlin 1945 meant for the men who survived, and for how wars truly end. In the days that followed, Berlin did not wake up. It lingered. Smoke still drifted through streets where no one walked. Fires burned themselves out in buildings that no longer had owners. The sound of artillery was gone, but the city rang with something else now. Shovels striking rubble, boots moving debris, voices calling names that would never be answered. For many, the war ended not on May 2nd, but weeks later, when hunger finally eased, or when a missing relative was confirmed dead, or when it became clear that the world they had known no longer existed. German soldiers were marched east and west, gathered into columns that stretched for kilometers. Some still believed captivity would be brief. Others understood, with quiet dread, that they were stepping into another ordeal entirely. Many would never return home, not because of ideology, but because history does not stop moving just because the guns fall silent. Civilians learned new rules overnight, new authorities, new uniforms, new fears. Survival meant adaptation. Silence became currency. Memory became dangerous. In shattered apartments, families rebuilt rooms inside rooms. Curtains were hung where walls once stood. Furniture was salvaged from ruins and dragged across streets that had no names anymore. Life returned, not because the war had ended, but because it had to. For Soviet soldiers, Berlin was both destination and burden. Some wrote letters home describing victory. Others said nothing at all. Many carried the city with them for the rest of their lives, not as a triumph, but as a weight. A place where the fighting had come so close that it had erased any sense of distance between killer and killed. Years later, veterans would struggle to explain what Berlin had been like. Words like battle or siege felt inadequate. It had been something more intimate, more suffocating. A place where men fought not armies but spaces. Rooms, corners, staircases. Historians would count divisions, tanks, guns. They would debate strategy, timing, decisions made in bunkers and headquarters. But none of that captured what Berlin really was in 1945. Berlin was where the modern war devoured itself, where ideology collapsed under its own weight, where command dissolved into instinct, where victory tasted like ash. The fall of Berlin did not resolve the war's meaning. It exposed it, that beneath the uniforms and slogans, war is a process of breakdown, of systems failing, of people pushed past endurance until only habit remains. There was no final charge because there was nothing left to charge with. Only fragments, fragments of armies, fragments of cities, fragments of lives, and those fragments did not disappear when the fighting stopped. They carried on, into the Cold War, into divided Germany, into memories passed down and reshaped with time. Berlin was rebuilt, streets were cleared, new buildings rose where ruins once stood. Children grew up playing in places where men had died by the thousands. But the city never forgot, and neither should we. Because if Berlin 1945 teaches anything, it is this: wars do not end when someone wins. They end when everything that made them possible is finally broken. And even then, the cost remains. Even after the city was quiet, even after the surrender was official, the rubble continued to speak. Windows gaped open like empty eyes. Roofs sagged under debris. Streets were riddled with craters, both shallow and deep, hiding fragments of lives, letters, photographs, and uniforms. The city's heartbeat had slowed, but it had not stopped. Echoes of what had happened remained in every corner, in every basement, in every scarred wall. Survivors walked among it like ghosts themselves. Some searched for family, some for friends, some for nothing at all, just needing to move through space that no longer held meaning. Children, once hidden in cellars, now wandered through streets filled with fire-blackened buildings, learning the shape of destruction before the shape of normal life. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians had died in the final days. But numbers alone could not capture the reality. A mother carrying her child through a street of rubble, a young soldier staring blankly at the ceiling of a collapsed building, a neighbor helping another sift through debris for a family photograph. The war had ended, yet its presence was everywhere. Berlin's collapse was mirrored by a collapse of identity. For many Germans, the ideology that had driven them was gone, and with it, the illusion of purpose. For the soldiers who survived, there was shame, guilt, and an understanding that what they had fought for no longer existed. For the civilians, survival was not enough. They had to navigate a world where normal rules no longer applied, where former enemies were now authorities, and where nothing could be taken for granted. The city became a lesson in human resilience and in the fragility of structure, both physical and social. Reconstruction began not as a symbol of triumph, but as an act of necessity. Streets were cleared of rubble. Buildings were patched or demolished. Children went back to school amidst ruins. Markets reopened in damaged plazas. People learned to live again in the spaces between destruction. Yet Berlin never fully healed. Layers of memory were embedded in the foundations, in the scars of walls, in the streets themselves. Every reconstruction was built upon loss. The new city was a city of fragments, just as the battle had been, just as the war itself had been. The fall of Berlin was not a story of a single decisive moment. It was hundreds of small collapses stacked together, streets, stairwells, families, soldiers. It was a war condensed into chaos, into personal survival, into the minute-by-minute experience of men and women trapped inside a city that no longer resembled a city. And in the quiet after the fighting, Berlin stood as a testament. not to victory, not to defeat, but to the cost of war when systems collapse and people are left to carry the consequences. The lessons of Berlin in 1945 are simple and brutal. War is not about glory, it is about endurance, about the slow, grinding erosion of humanity, of cities, of order. It is about what remains when everything else has been broken. And when you walk the streets of Berlin today, it is almost impossible to see the city that was, but impossible to forget it. Because the ghosts of that final collapse linger, not in monuments, not in flags, but in the memory of what happens when a war does not end with a charge or a parade, but with a disintegration. Berlin fell not in a single moment, but in thousands of small, terrible moments. And those moments, each one devastating in its own way, are the real story of the city and the war that ended there. The final days of Berlin left no room for illusions. The city had been stripped of pretense, of pride, of order. What remained were human beings trying to survive in a place that had been consumed by war, smoke, and fire. For soldiers, both German and Soviet, the experience became less about strategy and more about instinct. Every movement measured in seconds, every doorway a potential death trap, every street corner a line that might never be crossed again. Many would carry these memories for decades, the smell of smoke and blood, the taste of dust in their mouths, the weight of a rifle that had become an extension of survival itself. For civilians, survival was a daily negotiation. Hunger, exposure, and fear of lingering snipers dictated every choice. Parents protected children, neighbors protected neighbors, but nothing could shield anyone from the vast, indiscriminate consequences of the collapse. Children who had never known peace learned to recognize the sounds of artillery, the signals of approaching tanks, and the ways to move unseen through broken streets. For them, Berlin was a school of endurance, not history. As Soviet forces consolidated control, the city slowly began to breathe again. Streets were cleared, fires extinguished, and the dead buried. But Berlin's wounds ran deeper than rubble and ash. Every building carried memory. Every street told a story. Every scar in the landscape marked a human loss that could never be quantified. The Reichstag, once the symbolic center of power, became a monument not to triumph, but to survival. Soldiers posed on its steps for photographs, but the truth lingered in its halls. Victory had come at a cost too great to celebrate. The walls, riddled with bullet holes and fire damage, held the echoes of desperate last stands and close-quarter fighting that defied cinematic depiction. For Germany as a nation, the fall of Berlin was not a moment of closure, but of reckoning. The ideology that had led millions to war had been dismantled, leaving behind confusion, shame, and the immense task of rebuilding. The survivors, both soldiers and civilians, were charged with piecing together a world that had been shattered physically, morally, and psychologically. The city itself became a teacher. Berlin taught that wars are not ended by parades or speeches, but by collapse, by the disintegration of structures, societies, and expectations. It taught that the experience of war is not measured in victories, but in survival, in the endurance of ordinary people caught inside extraordinary violence. And so, Berlin 1945 remains a cautionary tale. Not of glory, not of heroism in the traditional sense, but of the human cost when armies, ideologies, and cities collapse under the weight of conflict. It is a story of fragments, of people, buildings, streets, and lives reduced to pieces, and of the struggle to continue when the world you knew no longer exists. In the end, the fall of Berlin was not a battle, and it was not a surrender. It was a disintegration, a city consumed from within, a society unmade, and a war that ended not with ceremony, but with silence. The silence was heavy, thick with the weight of everything lost, and yet, from that silence, life persisted. Berlin would rise again, people would return, streets would be rebuilt, children would play where soldiers once fell, But the lessons of 1945 would never leave the city. Because Berlin did not fall, it collapsed. And that collapse is what truly defines the end of the Third Reich, and the cost of war itself.